Thomas puts the brakes on. It was a busy time on the island of Sodor. The Sodor River Bridge was being rebuilt. Thomas had been chosen to help the builders. He was very busy and very proud. Thomas was at the yards. He was excited. And Thomas chuffed carefully out of the yard. Thomas had to stop at a signal. But when he applied his brakes, Thomas heard a squeaking sound. Thomas was worried. Stanley was there. He was taking builders to the bridge. And Thomas chuffed quickly away. Next, Thomas saw Emily. Thomas applied his brakes. The squeak was much louder, and his brakes wouldn't work properly. Thomas raced round the bend much too fast. Thomas's wheels hit a bump in the track. Some of the special blocks bounced off his flatbed. But Thomas didn't know. He was worried about his squeaking brakes. He thought. Thomas arrived at the top of a steep hill. As he went downhill, Thomas started to roll faster. Thomas applied his brakes, but they still weren't working properly, and the squeak was even louder. Gordon was puffing up the hill. But Thomas couldn't slow down. He raced into an emergency siding, and he hit the buffers with a big bump. More of the special blocks bounced off his flatbed. They tumbled down a steep bank. Now there was only one stack left. But Thomas still didn't notice. He was still worried about his squeaking brakes. Thomas set off once more, very slowly, for the bridge. Finally, Thomas saw the Sodor River Bridge ahead. The builders were waiting. Thomas knew he had to slow down now, but he couldn't. Thomas's brakes had stopped working altogether. With a clang and a crash, Thomas clanked off the rails. His flatbed bashed his buffers with a bump. The last of the special blocks fell from his flatbed into the water. The workmen attached chains to Stanley and Thomas. Slowly, Stanley pulled Thomas back to safety. Thomas was upset. He huffed to himself. Thomas remembered the bump on the bridge. It had made the last blocks fall from his flatbed. He thought. Thomas remembered where he had hit the buffers. Then he remembered going over the very bumpy track. Thomas knew what he had to do. Soon, Stanley was chuffing along. He shunted Thomas behind him, and Murdoch shunted Rocky. They reached the bottom of the steep hill. Soon, Rocky had lifted the blocks onto Stanley's flatbed, and they all puffed on. Thomas and Stanley found the rest of the special blocks at the sharp bend, and Rocky set to work. Soon, Stanley shunted Thomas back into the yard, and he set off proudly with the special blocks. A worker looked at Thomas's wheels. Later that day, Thomas chuffed back to the Sodor River Bridge. Thomas put his brakes on. There was no squeak at all. He stopped right beside Stanley.